Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. It's Cynicalex, and today we're going to be ranking all tier 4 characters as if they were tier 4 strikers. Now, I know you can use tier 3, tier 2 characters as strikers, but generally speaking, tier 4 strikers are the best because they're going to give you the most bars, up to a maximum of 6, and they're going to deal the most damage in addition to having other effects. But don't worry, because I already have a tier list set up here. I already have it partially filled out with some of the less useful tier 4 strikers, and we do have other categories besides just high damage. Just to go through the categories really quickly for you guys: iframe skills. So when you set this character as your tier 4 striker and you press the tier 4 button, they will jump out and do their skill, and their skill will have iframe ignore. That's very, very useful, particularly for PvP. High damage is self-explanatory. ABL canceling, because it's very difficult to get certain ABL effects like fracture, shock, or snare. So sometimes you have to resort to using a tier 4 striker. That is going to be meaningful. And then the last one there we have is PvP crowd control or AoE. AoE stands for area of effect. Crowd control is any other effect besides iframe ignore. So you're talking about like snare, stun, fear, incapacitation. Incapacitation removes an active buff. It's not actually a crowd control effect, but it still gets lumped in because it's a PvP effect, because you can't strip buffs away from PvE bosses. But, you know, burn, all defense down, all that stuff is crowd control. And so having a tier 4 striker that can pop in and deal a large AoE skill that has a lot of different crowd control abilities, for example, Apocalypse, is very, very useful. And if we go in game to Apocalypse, we will see why his tier 4, like why as a striker he's good, because he uses Apocalyptic Ritual. This tries to apply stun, silence, mind control, incapacitation. So it tries to apply 3 different crowd controls, and it tries to strip your active buff, which is very, very good. And it's also a very large AoE. So this is a pretty solid striker skill for, you know, lesser PvP characters. Obviously, it's not one of the best striker skills, but it is not bad at all. So we're going to go through and take a look at a bunch of, basically all the tier 4 striker skills. In like all the tier 4 characters that can be used as tier 4 strikers. Again, you can use ones outside of this list for sure. You can use any of these characters when they're not tier 4 for sure, but you're obviously going to get the most bang for your buck if these characters are tier 4. But I wouldn't use this list, like I wouldn't tier 4 a character to use as a tier 4 striker. It's just something to know. So we're going to start off with just not strong or useful. In general, almost all of these characters don't have any of the following. So they don't have iframe ignore, they don't have an important ABL cancel or rare one, they don't deal high damage, and then they don't have lots of crowd control slash AoE. There are a couple of exceptions, like for example Hulkbusters has incapacitation and a couple of other ones. I think she has snare or something like that, but in general these characters are just not going to be used for their striker abilities because they're just not very good. For example, on the other hand, Carnage, he does his 5th skill, which has a ton of damage. Also, keep in mind with these striker skills that whatever buffs are on them won't apply to you, but will apply to the attacker. So in this case, for Carnage, it gives him that 100% damage proc, which is excellent. This is also an iframe skill, so I would actually rank it an iframe skill, but it's also high damage. These are not necessarily ranked in terms of their value. I'm not necessarily saying iframe is the best, because, for example, someone like Elektra has iframe ignore on her striker skill. She does her 2nd skill, I believe, or her 5th. And yeah, she does her 5th, twin slash, which does iframe ignore, but it might not do a lot of damage because Elektra's a speed type and that sort of thing. So just keep that in mind for those characters. And, you know, they're just ranked in terms of how useful they are, not in terms of how much damage they do. But then characters like Captain America has good damage, also has, I believe, fracture and paralysis, so you could put him on either one of these, high damage or ABL cancel. We're going to put him there. Ancient One also has snare for an ABL cancel. Gambit also has an ABL cancel, but he just does really high damage. He does his 5th skill, that card attack, and that just does a truckload of damage. Yelena's has a bunch of crazy buffs. It's actually nuts. So she has a bunch of different cancels. She's probably one of the best for canceling. She has like 6 different. Let me just read this out for you here, guys. She has burn, shock, silence, incapacitation, and paralysis. Crazy. All 3 ABX on one skill and 1 ABL. Pretty nutty there. Certainly versatile in a way to help you out. A couple more here that have high damage and or iframe ignore. Punishers, high damage and iframe ignore, so just take your pick. I think is one of the best sort of sleeper picks for a striker skill. Same thing with Null. He uses his second skill. Punisher uses his fourth. Null uses his second, and that's an insane iframe skill, and it just does a ton of damage. Wolverine is also an iframe ignore high damage skill. So again, you can take your pick here. I guess iframe ignore is better, but this is like also being ranked in terms of how valuable the skill is itself because of how much damage it deals. So I do try to rank these characters horizontally, although I'm not necessarily ranking them vertically based on the different categories, because it's up to you, right? It's up to what you value. If you need an iframe ignore striker, if you need a high damage striker, if you need PvP, crowd control, this kind of thing, it's going to depend and it's going to be different. Of course, no list is complete without highlighting the two GOATs, or the three GOATs, I should say, of ABL, high damage, burst damage. You have the new GOAT with Miles Morales, but you also have Ghost Rider, who was, you know, also a GOAT of lesser proportions, but still, you know, a GOAT. And then also Black Widow. In the case of Black Widow, her ability also has iframe ignore. It's her fourth skill. So again, you can rank it based on what you need it for. It also has shock and paralysis, so you can use it for that kind of thing. But it is a pretty high damage iframe ignore skill, so I'd probably put it somewhere in the realm of that. And then for Ghost Rider, it's super high damage, but yeah, it probably goes somewhere like that. Again, this will fluctuate maybe depending on whether you prefer PvE or PvP, but still, you know, rank them accordingly. Moving along here, we don't have the icon for the new Medusa uniform, but it does have one ABL cancel. That's, you know, worth what it is to you, but you could also put it here. I just wanted to highlight her separately in case you're wondering, oh, where's Medusa? I just don't have the new icon for her. I couldn't find it on the forums. Hellstorm is just pretty high damage for his ability. Same thing with Mephisto, just very, very high damage, nice AoE, that sort of thing. Not necessarily for PvP, but good. Quicksilver has iframe ignore, which is very, very useful. Possibly more useful than Punisher. It's kind of difficult to say here. Shang-Chi, I would probably put him in not useful. I probably should have, you know, filtered him out earlier. Gladiator, it's not really high damage. It only has one ABL cancel, so I'd probably put him in not useful as well. I wasn't able to do all of them. But Sharon Rogers, it's her fourth skill. It just has high damage. That's pretty much all it is, but it doesn't have any sort of special effects. Groot's is pretty useless, so we'll put him down here. Same thing with Captain Marvel. It's just kind of damage. Same thing with Mr. Fantastic. It's basically just damage. And believe it or not, despite just being damage, Juggernaut's striker skill has iframe ignore. So I'm going to move my camera down here, but we actually have a lot of iframe ignore characters that can be used as tier 4 strikers. Crescent only has fracture, so you could put her here, but honestly, I think it's pretty not very useful. Weapon Hex is just her third skill. It's just kind of whatever damage, whatever ability. Psylocke at least does her fifth skill, and it has a damage proc, so that's pretty solid damage for you to rely on as a striker. Deadpool uses his fifth skill, which is a pretty large AoE, and it doesn't really have a lot of abilities, but it's a nice skill because it has incapacitation, and it's a pretty long skill, kind of like Wolverine's fifth. Same thing goes for Emma. It has Snare, which is an ABL ability, but it also just has some pretty nice AoE, but it only applies Snare, so it's not like too great to use as a striker skill. For the rest of the Fantastic Four here, Invisible Woman uses her fifth, which is pretty nice because it has Snare incapacitation as well. And then Human Torch uses his third, which honestly, it's not very good, so we'll just put that there. Shala Balls, on the other hand, uses her fifth, which has iframe ignore and is very useful. So would probably put her up here with Punisher and Carnage, possibly even ahead of Carnage. It's tough to say, but I think it's honestly pretty solid. Loki's is pretty interesting. I would say it's high damage, but it's conditional because, of course, you want lots of mobs. So for game modes like zombie survival, Loki's is very, very good. He's a very strong tier 4 striker because his fifth skill, of course, has those puddles that can explode. That's also technically AoE, but it's not PvP. It's a PvE kind of AoE. So just be careful with Loki's. But if you understand how his skill works, then you'll understand that it is pretty solid for large mobs. So probably put him, he honestly deserves to be probably somewhere around there based on the amount of damage that skill does if you can maximize 5 or more mobs. Dr. Octopus just does damage, has the proc with the 100% proc, which is nice. Spider-Man does get iframe ignore on his ability, and it also has remove active buff, which is pretty crazy. So Spider-Man is honestly a pretty solid striker, often used on blast types if they're going to mirror match in order to kill other blast types who will have a type disadvantage versus Spider-Man. Thor, you can actually use his previous uniform to deal more damage, but he's just basically high damage. He's basically just a high damage tier 4 striker. Same thing goes with Odin, just kind of like a high damage striker. I don't even know, to be honest, how strong, but it is his 4th skill, so that damage is pretty good. Unfortunately, Hulk's 5th skill is not an endless 5th skill. He just comes in and pops it for a second. So although it does have a 100% damage proc, I kind of hesitate to put it in high damage. I don't think it's that great of a striker ability. Same thing with Iron Man, unfortunately. You can't really get the value from all of his passives and stuff because he just comes in and pops his 4th skill, which has the proc, but it's also not his damage skill. Like, you want it to be passed to his 5th, and obviously you can't do that as a striker, so it doesn't really work. Doctor Strange, despite it being his 3rd skill, still does pretty decent damage, so I would put him in kind of that high damage category. Bucky's 5th skill, I don't think it's very good, to be honest with you guys. Haven't seen many people use Bucky. I'm using the old combat Bucky, but it's basically the same thing here. Black Bolt does use his 4th skill, which is like decent damage wise. It's decent AoE wise, but yeah, man, it's not gonna cut it anymore in this meta of characters. Venom uses his 3rd skill, which has Fracture, but it's not that great. Thanos and Ebony Maw are pretty nice because they both have AoE, and they both have multiple debuffs, multiple cleansing debuffs like Incapacitation, Mind Control, Remove Active Buff, Snare, Stun Fracture, stuff like that. So they are actually quite good, and Thanos is honestly quite a surprisingly good striker because of that. Gwenpool, Wong, and Hela honestly should have been in the not strong or useful category from the beginning. So we'll just move them there now because their abilities just don't have any cool effects and don't really deal a lot of damage. While Cyclops' doesn't deal much damage either, Jean Grey and Agent Venom both have iframe ignore, which is pretty nuts. So I'm going to put Agent Venom here with Elektra, and then Jean, of course, does her 2nd skill, which is quite nice because it has a ton of different debuffs. It has Time Freeze, Burn, Incapacitation, Paralysis. So although it doesn't deal a lot of damage, it is good for applying debuffs if you have the chance. Storm just deals a boatload of damage, so she's going to go in high damage around Thor's level, Doctor Strange's level. Unfortunately, Rogue doesn't deal that much damage with her 3rd skill. It's okay, but I wouldn't really, it's not too much to write home about. And then Magneto is also not very good. He's, old uniform, low DPS, that sort of thing. You guys kind of know how it goes. Scarlet Witch does her new 5th skill, which has Fracture, which is nice, but it also does a lot of damage, so she becomes kind of like a burst damage possibility, probably under Doctor Strange. We've already talked about Apocalypse. Cable does his 2nd skill, which is absolutely terrible, so he's going to go like in the middle of the pack here. Adam, unfortunately, doesn't do his 2nd skill. He does his 4th. Now, his 4th is not bad because it's a long skill and it has Snare and Incapacitation. It's kind of a PvP skill. It's kind of a PvP striker. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. And usually people are going to build their Adam Warlocks for PvP anyways. Luna is one that I actually want to highlight because it is also like Loki's in the sense that it's a large AoE skill, which is quite useful for PvE content, but it also has Chill, Freeze, and Silence and Paralysis. I think there's a world where you could put her in PvP crowd control AoE because it's got the AoE and it's got the crowd control. But for the time being, we'll put it in high damage just because it has such a large reach, but it's not that amazing. So, try in stuff like zombie survival if you need a striker. Unfortunately, Magic doesn't get to transform with her 2nd skill. It's her 4th skill. It's okay. Nothing to write home about too much, so I'm just going to put her there. Dr. Doom and Bishop just deal damage and not too much of it. Namor is one of the more interesting ones along with Loki because his 3rd skill sends out a bunch of discs, and the discs will hone in on target. So if you have just one target, if you're facing just like one boss, Namor can actually do quite a bit of damage. However, if you have multiple targets, each disc will hit the target and kill the lesser mobs, and so that weakens the overall potency of his ability. Now, unfortunately for Silver Surfer, despite having a huge AoE, it's a pretty low damage 5th skill that he has, and it just has a massive AoE, and it also doesn't have any debuffs, any like incapacitation or anything like that. So I kind of hesitate to put it here. I'm doing it kind of because I like him so much, but yeah, it's not very good, and you should probably look for better strikers that we've already talked about previously. Beta Ray build does have Fracture, so I would say that's a pretty important cancel, and it's a nice 5th skill with a damage proc, so it has some pretty good DPS on it as well. And then Madeline does her 4th skill, which has Fracture, Incapacitation, and Panic, which is very nice for PvP. So I would say that she is kind of an underrated, slept-on striker. We have the old Miles here. We're going to ignore him. Rest here don't really do much aside from Kingpin and Blue Dragon. They both have ABL cancels, Kingpin having Snare and Blue Dragon having Shock. The rest of these guys here from Gamora over, they just deal sort of middling amounts of damage with their 2nd or 4th skills. And then although Bullseye has Incapacitation, it's not really going to be that good for PvP. So this is how the list ends up. It's mostly informative, but I've also added in the additional depth of ranking them horizontally. So I think by far the best iframe ignore striker, it's iframe ignore, not iframe. Iframe ignore striker skill is Wolverine, and then probably the worst one is Juggernaut. And then for ABL cancels, it's again flavor of the month, kind of what you need. And then of course Miles comes in for #1 for high damage, and that's really important because he is used as an ABX ABL striker. Keep in mind, Ghost Rider and Black Widow are also used for that, and they also deal tons of damage. Miles is just not used in other content where iframe ignore is needed because his ability doesn't have iframe ignore. So the best way to sort of identify the difference between these two categories, between red and orange, is that orange can be used for PvE content, and red can be used for PvE and PvP content. So red is technically more useful overall. It's going to have more overall value. But then, of course, if you look at like some of the lower end characters here, like Agent Venom or Juggernaut, they're really not going to deal much damage with their iframe ignore skills. Whereas the high end of the high burst damage are going to be super useful for ABX, ABL, World Boss, GBR, Zombie Survival, and that is going to make a much larger difference. So yeah, you do have a lot of drop off as you go along horizontally, and especially when you get to that 2nd row, it's certainly not nearly as good. But then also keep in mind that probably half or more of the characters are just not very good because they don't feature burst damage, iframe ignore, or useful effects or debuffs. So that's the list. That's the ranking. That is how I would prioritize strikers. This is particularly useful for PvP, where you can utilize a lot of iframe ignore strikers, even ones that people forgot about, like Punisher, Quicksilver, Elektra, etc. Particularly for things like TBA and Alliance Conquest. So get those tier 4 strikers swapped in, swapped out. Update their builds as well. I didn't really mention this earlier, but their builds matter because when they're coming in and doing their attack, it's looking at, hey, what are the builds like? What's the Uru? What's the ISO set? What's the CTP? It absolutely matters. So, and that matters just as much for PvP as it does for PvE. So yeah, take a look into that, guys. Hopefully this has been helpful. Thank you so much for watching the video. Smash the like button, share the content, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.